Good morning, East Coast International Church, for like another 18 minutes. How are we doing this morning? Good? It's good to be with you all here today. If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Jesse Lobato, and I have the amazing privilege of being one of the pastors here, overseeing our youth ministry and all things media. And I'm honored to be able to wrap up this Genesis series we've been in while Pastor Kurt has been away in his mini sabbatical. And I don't know about you guys, but I kind of miss Pastor Kurt, so I'm kind of excited to see him again. This week, but you guys will see him again next Sunday. And don't tell him I said this, but he called me yesterday because he came back to the States, and I was like, it's like the best thing to wake up to. But you didn't hear that from me, okay? But I'm just glad that he's been able to go away and to kind of have his sabbatical. But it's been great to hear all of our other pastors speak every Sunday, right? It's been awesome. It's really been awesome to just be able to work with them, to be able to work closely with them during this summer, and I just appreciate the summer we've been able to have together, just working so cohesively together. And just like the great psalmist Drake once said, man, I love my team, so we can give it up for our pastors again. About a year ago, Juana and I, along with our friend Cass, drove 12 whole entire hours down to the Amish County in Ohio to pick up this 6-week-old Aussie Doodle who would quickly become like our best friend. I couldn't tell you why we drove 12 hours for a dog. I could say, though, that it was 100% worth it, and I would do it all over again. I think we have a picture of my dude right there. His name's Oso. Look how cute he is, man. He's just the best. Since that picture, he's actually went from weighing 15 pounds to 75, so he's kind of a big dude now. You see him right there? Yeah. Don't let the hair fool you. He's bony as heck and is very uncomfortable to cuddle with, but he's a big, big dog. But since getting also, one of the things Juana and I, my wife, wanted to make sure with him was that he was okay with being alone, right? You see, I grew up with 2 tiny dogs, and whenever anyone left the house, for whatever reason, they would cry for the longest time. Like, sometimes I feel like I can still hear their cries, just like in my ears, it's like, right? It's just so the most annoying thing. And so I was like, babe, well, Oso, this is not going to happen. We need to make sure that Oso is trained in a way that he will not bark just because we left. So we would always try to leave him alone any moment we can. I'm not saying I neglected my dog, but any moment I didn't have to take him somewhere, I didn't. His crate is in the living room, so he doesn't sleep with us. And one of the things that we do is whenever we have to clean like the kitchen area or downstairs, because our living room is upstairs, we just leave him upstairs. We don't even let him come down with us. And what he's learned to do during this time is he's learned to entertain himself. He's learned to play by himself. He's gotten so good at playing by himself. Now he like grabs his chew toys and will like chuck them down the stairs so he can like fetch them. Like he literally learned how to play fetch by himself. It's actually really adorable. So anytime Juana and I leave him in the living room now as a 75-pound dog, we can hear him playing by himself from downstairs because our floors are kind of thin, and like we hear things from like toys dropping down the stairs. We hear his like giant paws walking. If he's really hyper up there, we can sometimes hear him jumping on furniture and it just like drags through the floor. And even though sometimes it can sound like there's this like wild stampede taking place right above us, we're never concerned because we know that the noise that he's making is just him playing, so we never have a problem with it. What we do have a problem with is that one day we were cleaning, doing our thing, and also was making his usual loud noise, and then at one moment it just went like silent. And I was like, oh, well, maybe he like actually tired himself out. He went to bed. So Juana and I ignored it. We just went on our way, and so we finished cleaning. We go upstairs to relax, and when we got up the stairs, we just saw a bunch of this like cushiony type material all over the living room, and in the middle was this bed. I think we have the bed here. This bed had a giant hole in it, and now you guys need to understand, that's all like compressed material. That was all spread throughout the whole living room, and in the corner of the living room, I remember Oso was just sitting looking at us like with the guiltiest face, like he knew he messed up. We got this bed for him, and it wasn't cheap. If you ever try to buy a bed for a 75-pound dog, you won't find a cheap one. And in a matter of a day or two, he completely destroyed it. And so now he just sleeps in his crate, he enjoys it, and we don't even bother trying to buy any other bed because he'll just tear it up. And since then, every time Oso has gone from loud to silent, Juana and I look at each other and we're like, we just left something out that we were not supposed to leave out. I mean, we have chewed up remotes with buttons that are coming off. We have torn up paper towels that we left up there from cleaning. We've even had our most favorite blankets to watch movies with all torn into shreds because this dude goes from loud to silent, and in his silence just creates chaos. And because of this, what we've learned, it's that it's never the noise that also makes that concerns us, it's his silence. Because whenever also goes from like super loud and crazy to silent, we know he's doing something wrong. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of us are alerted by like a sudden silence, right? Like maybe you have kids and they make all the noise in the world. They're always like fighting with each other, all that stuff. And in your house, like you're hearing this chaos and you're like, yeah, that's just how it is. But the minute they go silent, right, you just start thinking like, what are these dudes up to? Like my mom knew that whenever me and my brother went silent, I either hurt him, he hurt me, or we broke something. So like the silence creates like this suspicion, right? Or maybe you walk the same busy street at night, and it doesn't matter what time of the night it is, you just go fully confident that you'll be fine. But then on the nights where those busy streets are all of a sudden empty and silent, you just start fearing the worst, thinking that there's someone behind you walking at your pace, and so you just start kind of bolting home just to make sure you don't get killed, right? You know what I mean? And even if you look at like movies, right? Whenever you're watching the scene and it goes silent, you're waiting for that jump scare to come out of nowhere, right? And you start thinking the worst, like, yo, this girl is about to die right now, and you're just like kind of like bracing yourself for it. It seems that like the silence we experience in our lives is always the precursor to bad things happening. We think that if there's silence, it's because something's wrong, and for a lot of us, it's because in silence, bad things have happened to us, right? But if we're real with ourselves this morning, sometimes the silence that we experience that causes great concern for our lives isn't when our dogs just go from loud to silent or when a busy street suddenly becomes empty and quiet, but it's when God himself seems to have lost his voice in our lives, right? It's when we're in the midst of a rough situation and we've been stretching out to God and asking him to come through and to work on our behalf and have just been getting back silence, wondering what in the world is he up to. It's when we're in a place where it doesn't matter how much we've been reading or praying or attending church, God just feels so far and so silent. And out of that silence, you begin to feel like you've been ignored by him, abandoned by him, and you even begin to question what you might be doing wrong. And we've seen and we've been hearing about so many historical figures all throughout Genesis that have dealt with crazy suffering, that have dealt with doubt, that have walked in the most disobedient of ways. And in the midst of it, right, they heard from God in a miraculous way. In the midst of it, God met with them in a supernatural way. We've seen God have a conversation with Abraham about this great promise he had for him. We've seen God speak to Hagar in her loneliest moments. We've seen God send angels to free Lot and his family. We've even seen God wrestle with Jacob and put the work on him, right? We've seen it happen, and maybe, we read those stories and we're like, God, like you did all that for them, but why isn't that happening in my life? And we think as if this is the only way that he has to operate. But in the life of a man named Joseph that we'll be diving into today, we see that for him that wasn't the case or his story. See, Joseph is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and Joseph was his dad's favorite. And because he was his dad's favorite, he was hated by his 11 brothers for it. And we're introduced to this 17-year-old Joseph in Genesis 37, who had this dream one night that he would rule over his brothers. So Joseph did what anyone who had a dream of ruling over brothers who hated them would do. He told them, right? Like he told them. He probably said it in a little arrogant way. And because of the dream, they hated him even more because of it. And then Joseph has another dream where now the dream's telling him, you're not only going to rule over your brothers, but you're going to rule over your whole family. And so what does Joseph do? He goes back to his brothers, back to his family. He said, hey, I'm about to rule over all of you guys. And because of those dreams, what we find is that Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers. And then his brothers ended up faking his death to their father. And then just so that they can profit off of Joseph, they end up selling him into slavery. And in this pit that Joseph found himself in, this pit that he was brought to just because he communicated this dream, we don't read of a direct message from God to Joseph that, hey, everything's going to work out. I have a plan for you. Don't worry about it. We don't see any miraculous intervention taking place, like an angel swooping down and taking Joseph out of the pit. All we read about is that Joseph is sold to a man named Potiphar, who was the main bodyguard of Pharaoh, the ruler of the nation at that time. And even when things seemed to be going well with Potiphar, as Joseph went from slave to manager of Potiphar's house, it quickly went south as Potiphar's wife tries to force Joseph to sleep with her. And even though Joseph made all the right decisions, refusing to do so, even at one point having to physically run away from this woman, she would end up falsely accusing Joseph of forcing himself on her, which then puts him in prison without trial, without a case for defense. And Joseph would spend years in this prison. And just like when he was in the pit, We don't read of Joseph having a direct message from God that, hey, I'm going to lead you out of this. You'll be all right. We don't read of any miraculous intervention taking place that would free Joseph from prison. And you almost have to wonder what Joseph might have been thinking at this point, right? Like after doing all of the right things to end up in all of the wrong places, he probably wondered where God was in all of it. He probably wondered if there was any hope for him now that he found himself in prison, because it seems like through it all, God is silent. And we see a glimmer of hope as Joseph would gain favor over the prison ward because Joseph became the manager over all the inmates. And during this time as manager, Pharaoh would send 2 of his officials to prison. And while in prison, both officials had these scary dreams that shook them to the core, that when they woke up, Joseph saw that they were not at ease. And so he asked them what's going on. They both told him, we had these crazy dreams and we have nobody to help us interpret them. And so Joseph is like, hey, God is in the business of interpreting dreams, so like explain it. And when Joseph interprets the first official's dream, saying that Pharaoh would take him out of prison and restore him to his position as cupbearer, Joseph had one request for this cupbearer, and it was that, hey, this is what your dream means, and when you get back into that place in your rightful position with Pharaoh, please just remember me. You see, because to Joseph, this would be his ticket out. After being wrongfully sold by his brothers and wrongfully thrown into prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer could be the guy to get him out of all this just by simply mentioning Joseph to Pharaoh. And just 3 days later, the dream comes true. The cupbearer is back in Pharaoh's palace working. But by this point, he forgot all about Joseph, forgot all about his request. And this left Joseph in prison for another 2 years, back at square one, in the same place, wondering where God was in all of this. The moment life changed for the better for Joseph was when Pharaoh started to have some scary dreams too now. And when no one in Pharaoh's corner could interpret his dreams, the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. And when they bring Joseph to interpret this dream, listen to what he says in Genesis 41, verse 16. He says, "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied, "but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." Here, Joseph is face to face with arguably the most powerful man of his time. This was his chance to finally get himself out of the years of wrongful accusations and suffering. This would be the moment for Joseph to be like, yes, I am that guy. I can do this. And even if he couldn't interpret the dreams, man, if I was Joseph, I would have just said something just so he can free me. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I would do. But what did he do? He looked at Pharaoh and said, hey, it's beyond me, but my God can do it. Amen. And by faith, Joseph was able to interpret Pharaoh's dream. He was able to tell him about the 7 years of prosperity that would take place in the land, but then the 7 years of famine that would come after. And in order to prepare properly for what was about to happen, Joseph said that Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. So Pharaoh looks, takes in the advice, says that's awesome, and he looks at Joseph and says, hey, I want you to be that guy. And what this meant was that Joseph would be second in command to a whole nation. And to put it all into perspective, this is all taking place 13 years after he was thrown into the pit. And through all the jacked up things that took place in the life of Joseph, what happened here was more than Joseph could ever have imagined. And if we fast forward to when the famine came, the nation was struggling for food, and they all came to Joseph to buy supplies, which included none other than his family and his brothers. And you'll find in Genesis that they have this wild exchange of events, and at one point, Joseph finally reveals to his brothers who he is. And when his brothers realized that the one man who could provide them with the resources they needed during a great famine was none other than the brother whose death they faked. It was none other than the brother that they sold into slavery. And the Bible says that when they saw that this was Joseph, they were terrified. And the moment when Joseph could have had his payback for all that they put him through, here's how he responds. Genesis 45 says that, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Joseph tells his brother to come close, and I'm sure all of us were thinking he was probably just going to do like a row of backhands, right? Like when he came in. But he tells his brothers, hey, don't worry about what you did. Don't be angry at yourselves on what you did, because God is sending me ahead of you. And I want to make it very clear that Joseph is not excusing his brothers from their evil actions, nor is he saying that God was the one that caused those evil actions to happen. But what he's saying is that God used the evil actions of man to further his divine purposes for the life of Joseph. Joseph says it another way in Genesis 50:20. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." Joseph was not crediting himself for doing things on his own or scheming his own way out, but he was saying that it was the very hand of God that brought him through the pit, that helped him survive through the prison and brought him to the promotion in Pharaoh's palace. That God brought him to this very point where he can now be used to help solve a national crisis. And what we find is that even when God seemed silent in Joseph's life, Joseph still believed that God would see him through. In God's silence, Joseph continued to trust and obey. Through it all, Joseph remained submitted to God, even in what felt like the most silent moments. When you read through Joseph's journey, it's hard to see how God is moving, but when you can just get to the end and just look back, you see that God was working in and through Joseph the whole entire time. And what we learn from Joseph is just because God may feel silent in our lives does not mean that God is absent from our lives. In the midst of God's silence, three things remain evident in Joseph's life that I believe are true for us today. And the first is that God's silence does not mean an absence of God's presence. Though we never read about any miraculous exchanges Joseph had, we're told that he was never alone. In Genesis 39, when Joseph was sold to Potiphar, verse 2 says that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When he was wrongly thrown into prison later, in verse 21, it says that the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Whatever high or low point Joseph found himself at, Genesis keeps this one consistent theme through it all, and it's that the Lord was with Joseph. And because the Lord was with Joseph, he prospered in everything we did. And I know it's such a simple truth to communicate, but it's a truth we oftentimes have a hard time believing when God feels silent. And the reason why is that far too often we base the certainty of God's presence on how we're feeling and on how life is looking. When life is going great, we know God is with us, right? We walk with that confidence. When we feel the goosebumps during worship, we have all the faith in the world that God is moving in our midst. But when the trials come and the feelings fade, we begin to think, God, where are you and why aren't you doing anything? But church, faith is not a feeling. It's the foundation of where our hope comes from. And where our hope comes from is in the truth of God's word. The word that says in Psalms 145 that the Lord is close to all who call on him. Yes, to all who call on him in truth. When faith is just about feelings, we're led to think that the true sign of a growing faith is when we can feel God more. That in order for me to grow as a Christian, I need to feel God more in all places of life. And as a result, we think that the opposite is true, that if I'm having a hard time feeling God, it's because my faith isn't there. Or if I'm having a hard time feeling God, it's because my faith is dying out. And it's actually the false idea of this that does cause your faith to dwindle out. Because the true sign of growing faith is not when we can feel God more. The true sign of growing faith is when we begin to develop less of a need to always have to feel God to know that he is with us. That whether or not we have the goosebumps or whether or not life is going exactly how we want it, we still know that we are not alone because God is with us. Even if it was hard to see or feel, the Lord was with Joseph. And in helping him succeed in everything he did, the second thing we learn that is evident about God's silence is that God's silence does not mean an absence of God's provision. You see, Joseph didn't gain favor from Potiphar because of his skill set or charisma. Genesis 39, starting at verse 3, says that when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor. We see that it was God's providence in Joseph's life that turned him from slave to manager. And even when he was thrown into a prison and it seemed like nothing could be done, God provided favor again, making him manager over the inmates. And when the officials had terrible dreams they couldn't interpret, it was God who provided Joseph with the interpretation. And even when the officials forgot about Joseph, God never forgot about Joseph, because we know from the story that the rest is history. How many of us have ever heard of the verse of Philippians 4:13? I can do all things through him who gives me strength, or I can do all things through Christ. Yeah, right? Like we love it, right? It's a highly used verse. It's a verse I've heard a lot. We love using it when it comes into walking new opportunities or promotions or anything like that. Like maybe if I walked in like during my freshman year of basketball trials with this verse, like maybe I would have had different results. But I didn't have it at the time, man. But listen, I believe we can do all things through Christ. There's no doubt about it. But Paul the Apostle was the one who wrote this. And he wrote it not while waiting for a new job promotion or a new opportunity or a new door to open. He wrote this while he was chained up in prison, awaiting trial, wondering if this was the end of his life. And what he meant by it was, hey, whatever circumstance I find myself in, no matter how hard life is going, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Or another way to say it is all things through him who provides me with strength. Only because God did not provide a way out of what Joseph was facing doesn't mean that God wasn't providing at all. He wasn't providing a way out for Joseph, but he for sure was providing a way through for Joseph in what he was facing. Whether it was through people, positions, or dreams, Joseph was able to overcome every bit of difficulty people were putting him through purely because of the provision of God. See, God's provision over our lives may not always show up in him getting us out of something. Sometimes it may show up in him giving us the strength, resources, and wisdom to get through something. And you'll often find that going through something will produce a lot more perseverance, strength, and character in your lives than just getting out of something. You see, through God's provision, Joseph's character was developed. Through his provision, he was able to work on his ability to interpret dreams. And through God's provision, Joseph was well equipped for the position of a lifetime in being second in command to Pharaoh. God's silence does not mean an absence of his presence. It does not mean an absence of his provision. And God's silence does not mean an absence of God's promise. This is our theme that we've seen all throughout Genesis. You see, it turns out that Joseph's dream was not just some dream, but God's plan on how he would continue to fulfill his promise that was made to Abraham. And by Joseph working under Pharaoh, his dream, or better yet, God's plan and promise became a reality because in that moment, Joseph became ruler over his family. You see, without Joseph, his family would suffer under the famine that was taking place. He was their one source of aid that they had. This dream, this promise that so many people tried to destroy, this dream that started to seem more and more like a fantasy to Joseph became a reality, and here's why. It's because even in God's most silent moments, when it felt like everything that could go wrong went wrong, God was still present, providing, and working behind the scenes to ensure that his promises became realized in the life of Joseph. Worship team, you can come on up. You see, if I'm being honest, I honestly don't know why God sometimes is loud in this time of my life, and then he's quiet in this time. I honestly can't tell you why you can feel him so evidently in some places, and then in others you're wondering where he's even at. And honestly, I'm not really here to give you an answer to that. What I am here to say, and the one thing that I can be absolutely sure of, is that even when God feels silent and distant, he is never still. He is actively working and fighting on our behalf, present, providing, and keeping the promises he's made to us. Very early, right, in my relationship with Jesus, I felt the calling to pastor at the age of 16. And this would start a journey that would consist of all sorts of trials and detours. I mean, I had to navigate on what being called to pastor even meant, especially being the only believer in my home at the time. A couple of years later, at the start of my senior year, one of my close friends who actually introduced me to Jesus passed away unexpectedly, and I had to navigate the confusion and anger around that. After my first year of Bible college, I ended up having to leave because of finances. This would lead me to travel to the other side of the country on a plane for the first time by myself for a 9-month leadership program that only lasted 6 for a variety of reasons. And through each trial, though, I did feel God through it all. My prayers always felt heard. I never lost faith. And even in all the hoops I had to jump through, I still knew that God was there. And the calling to pastor became a reality in 2021 when Pastor Kerr offered the role to me, and things felt great. It felt awesome until last year. It felt like God finally brought me to this place he promised me when I was a teenager and was like, all right, my man, you got this from here. I'll be over there, and just vanished. 2022 was a hard year for me. I was getting sick every other month. I started dealing with constant anxiety for the first time. From the time I woke up to the time I went to bed, I was feeling defeated every waking day, and I honestly became scared to start my days because I just didn't want to deal with the weight anymore. I remember I told Juan, it just feels like I'm learning how to get punched in the face and be okay with it. Because that's how it felt. It felt like everything that I did was failing, and no matter what I tried to do or how much I tried to pray or read, it always felt like I was just met with unchanging circumstances and a silence from God. And at one point I began to ask, what am I doing wrong, God, and why aren't you doing anything? And I remember meeting with one of my friends, Stefan, explaining this struggle, trying to figure out if there's anything practical I can do to get me out of this mess. And I'll never forget it. He just said, bro, if all you can do right now is just simply show up and be present, just do your best at that. And I'm not going to lie, at first I was like, what type of generic fortune cookie advice did you just give me, bro? Right? But what he meant was that even when it seemed like nothing was happening, he was telling me to continue to trust and obey, that God is exactly who he says he is, that he's called me to exactly where I'm at, and that he will turn things around for me even if I don't hear, feel, or see it. He was just telling me, hey, keep showing up. So that's what I did. When anxiety and discouragement were haunting me, I did my best to show up, to be a good husband, to show up ready to work, pastor, to show up and be present in your lives. When it was hard to feel God was hearing me, I did my best to still show up in prayer. And when his word just didn't make sense to me and it wasn't speaking back to me, I just did my best to keep reading my Bible. And if I'm honest with you guys, I spent the majority of 2022 anxious and discouraged. All I was doing was just doing my best to show up. And at some point, things did begin to turn around, and I wish I could say that there was one switch that I was able to flip to change everything. But I was just doing all I could do, and it was showing up. To trust and obey God even when he felt far and silent. To trust that the Bible is his spoken word and that he speaks through it. To trust that he loves me and he sees me even if I can't find a reason to why he would. And to trust that he hears every prayer and holds the tears of every cry. I just showed up. And I was talking to someone summer of 22, explaining how tough of a year it's been. And I remember I told him, like, dude, this was probably like the worst year of my life. And he told me, well, why don't you wait? Because if you wait and you see who you become from this year, you might end up saying it was your best year of your life. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, bro, why you have all these people telling you fortune cookie advice? It's just like all this generic stuff, right? But standing here now, I can say that he was absolutely right. Absolutely right. I didn't see it at the time, but God was helping me navigate through hurt. God was helping me navigate through unhealthy views of myself, and he was even helping me navigate unhealthy views I had of him. God was resourcing me with tools like therapy and surrounding me with people whose presence in my life would go a long way. God even gave me Oso, bro, my dog, bro. He's the best. I love Oso. And I'm healthier and stronger today because of it, but most importantly, because of last year, I know that God is exactly who he says he is, and I don't always have to feel or see him in the moment to know that he is true to his word. That whatever or whoever intended or intends to harm me, I know that God intended and will intend it all for good. When I look back on my last year, though he felt silent at the moment, I can see that his footprints were all over 2022. In my discouragement and hopelessness and my desperate cries, he was there, present, providing, and keeping his promises. And the thing that I learned about footprints is that footprints aren't supposed to be the mark of where you're going, right? Footprints are supposed to be the mark of where you came from. And so you're not always going to see God's footprint in your life in the moment. But if you can just get through the hard seasons of when you're not feeling him or seeing him and you're able to look back, you will only see one set of footprints. But it's because it was not you that was walking this out. It was God that was walking you through it all. Present, providing, keeping his promises. Why don't we all stand today? I want to make sure we understand that God, he does want to speak to you in a mighty and miraculous way. Like he wants to show up evidently in your life. He wants to show off in your life. Like he wants to do those things. We've seen it throughout Scripture. We've seen it in your testimonies. What I'm trying to leave you with is that, yeah, sometimes God is loud and there's no way to miss him. But sometimes he's silent and it's really hard to see what he's up to. But no matter what, he is never still. God is always at work, even in the toughest trials of our lives, building us up as he works out his plan for us. You know, when I think of the story of Jesus, I just imagine the weight of silence he must have felt as he was on the cross, struggling to take his next breath, asking the Father, my God, why have you abandoned me? I imagine the weight of the silence his disciples felt as Jesus took his last breath and they heard that he died. As they scattered away, the silence and fear they felt, wondering if Jesus actually was who he says he was, wondering if he really was God, the Messiah. I'm sure it was hard to feel God. But what we now know is that out of that silence came salvation for you and for me today. And on that third day, God rose up from the grave, proving he was exactly who he came here and said he was. And if God brought salvation for the whole world, if he brought Joseph to an unimaginable place out of silence, what could God be brewing up out of the silence you're experiencing in your life? So as we sit through this question, if God feels silent to you today, my encouragement is that you won't let it be a signal for you to throw the towel and give up, but you will let it be a signal for you to press in, to keep showing up in your prayers, in your reading, in your worship, in your daily walk. Show up believing that the God who feels silent to you right now is actively working things out for your good. So as we get ready to sing this last song, the altars here are open for you to receive prayer if you need it and to spend time with God today.